new FERC XBRL requirements. Before we get started, I'd like to cover a few logistical points. We are offering CPE credit for today's session. So if you are getting CPE, even if you didn't sign up for it, you can still get it by responding to the questions, and we'll make sure that we get you signed up for that. So we will be taking questions at a couple of points during the call today. Just make sure that you respond to the poll question so that we can record your answers and get you the CPE credit. As we go through the program, you can submit questions to us by clicking on the Q&A link on the Zoom console that you should see there. You can just key in your questions and we'll take them as we go through the program. If you have any kind of technical difficulties, please email us at support@xbrl.us and we'll do our best to get you back up and online again. So with that, I'm going to talk to you a little bit about what we'll be covering today. Our speaker is Campbell Pride. Campbell is president and CEO of XBRL US. Campbell was also heavily involved in the development of the FERC taxonomy. So if you have questions, this is a really good chance to ask those questions of the person who's heavily involved in the development of the taxonomy. Campbell is going to be covering XBRL fundamentals. We are then going to take 2 CPE questions, and then he's going to go straight into some details about XBRL for FERC filers preparing their Form 60. We'll then cover a couple of other CPE questions and then talk about some other programs and events that might be of interest to you. So with that, we're going to give you a little bit of background on XBRL, and I will kick us off there. XBRL stands for Extensible Business Reporting Language. It is an open, non-proprietary language, and that means that it's a data standard that has no licensing fees associated with its use. It is very much a global standard. It's maintained by a nonprofit standards organization called XBRL International. XBRL International is responsible for maintaining and expanding upon the XBRL specification. It's been around for about 12 years now, but it continuously expands to meet changes in reporting requirements and changes in technologies. XBRL is used, as I mentioned, around the world. There are multiple country-specific jurisdictions, I believe about 26 of them. Here in the United States, XBRL US is the US jurisdiction of XBRL International. So we are the national standard setter for the United States. And our role is to be responsible for development work like the FERC project, and also for other types of adoption efforts here in the United States. We developed not only the FERC taxonomy, but also the taxonomies that are in use today by the Securities and Exchange Commission, which is, and those taxonomies are actually now managed by the FASB, the National Accounting Standards Board. And we've built other data standards for other reporting domains as well. One thing I think it's important to emphasize early on is what XBRL is not. It is a data standard, which is essentially a way of digitizing financial and other types of data, but it is not a technical format like XML or JSON or HTML or CSV. And it's not a product like an Excel spreadsheet or some other application that may be used to create or to create reports. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Campbell Pride. And Campbell is going to talk to you a little bit more in detail about how XBRL gives meaning to data.
Thank you, Michelle. And so what we see here is just a slide to try and to level set what XBRL actually is. And as Michelle mentioned, it's not a product or a software. It's just really a way, you can think of it more like a dictionary, and it's a standard way of identifying what things mean. So in a traditional form, here's the comparative balance sheet, for example. What XBRL is doing, it's just really giving meaning to everything that's on the form. And traditionally, that meaning was usually communicated in the form of like a GPS location, right? Column D, row 2. So you kind of had that information. You could find it using that syntax. And what XBRL doing, the main idea here is that rather than referencing data by a cell reference on a form, is really to move that to basically like a standardized term that can be shared across forms, and so that data can be more useful. You don't have to have intimate knowledge of the form and how the form's structured to understand the data. And obviously one of the problems with the form is that if you change the form, if you add some rows, then the meaning of all the data changes. So it's very difficult to track over time. So this is one of the advantages that XBRL has over traditional ways of collecting data in a form-based approach. So now, rather than referring to that, the value of something at D2, the information now can capture, what was the entity, what was the, what were the units of that value, what was the period, and what was the element associated with it. In this case, service company property. This also has the advantage when you've got time series data. If you're collecting lots and lots of data over time, the actual fact value has meaning, and you don't have to go back to the form and say what form did they submit it on. All that information is associated with the fact. So when we say XBRL gives meaning to data, that's what we're talking about. Every single fact that you report in the form has associated data with it, which really tells you what it means. So we go to the next slide, Michelle. And so with that context, the FERC has basically said, we want to collect this data in a more meaningful way. And so then what that means for you as a filer is you basically have to take the data that you had been filing in forms and you put it into an XML, XBRL format. So basically it looks like what's an XML file for those of you familiar with XML, but it basically has the XBRL metadata associated with it. So each individual fact has this information associated with it. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go through today's slides. So once you've got it in that format, then you can just submit it to the FERC. Some of you may be familiar with SEC filings that uses XBRL. In those cases, you've got to submit not only the XBRL file with the data in it, but you also have the option to file a lot of other data as well, which includes your own kind of little mini taxonomy. And we'll talk about what that means soon, but that you don't have to do with the FERC. So for this submission, there's only one file that needs to be submitted. It's basically the form data in an XML format. So we go to the next slide, please, Michelle. And so obviously one of the questions for filers that faces, well, how do I get this file? How do I create it? And how do I send it? So that there's probably 4 different ways that you could think about creating these files. Probably the hardest, but probably the better over the long term, is to generate the data directly from internal systems. So traditionally, a lot of this data has obviously been collected together, and then people have manually entered it into the Visual Fox Pro database, which had been submitted by FERC. So that the FERC's trying to get away from. So now, if you can get that data into the XML format, then you can just submit it to the FERC. So theoretically, there's no reason why, if you've got systems that have all that data in them, that you can't collate that data in an automated way, create the XML file, and then submit it to the FERC. So that's obviously one option. Now, this would probably only really be feasible if you're spending significant amounts of time preparing the form. So in the case of the Form 1, maybe this makes more sense. Maybe for the Form 60, it doesn't. It's just really something that's really dependent on what you need to do. The other complication with this is the FERC changes the data that they need. Then you may need to go back and then collect additional data in those systems and pull that data in. And that may be fine. There may be a component where you're just manually entering data anyway. Second, and this is probably what most people do, is to basically enter the form into a software application. There's a lot of software applications out there. We've got a list of those at the end of the presentation, which basically, they can just basically read the FERC taxonomy because it's a standard, and then it'll basically give you a form type format, and you can fill that data out. And some of those applications can also bulk download data straight into them as well, so that can make it significantly easier, so you don't have to manually enter everything in. Thirdly, you could create, and I've seen some companies are doing this. Some of the utility companies have said they're going to create their own software solution to generate the XBRL, and this really may be applicable for some of the smaller forms, maybe like the Form 714, which is basically you can basically collect it in Excel and then turn it into XBRL. Maybe you can do that for the Form 60, I don't know, but that may be another option. that you might want to consider, maybe you don't. Then lastly, you can just say, hey, I'm just going to give it to someone to do, and they can go out and they can do it for me. So there's kind of really 4 options, and what we're going to cover today, everything we discussed today is valid for all those 4 options, but we're really just going to bring to your attention things you should be aware of. So if you're going to build the software yourself, or if you're going to use someone else's software, you're going to hire a consultant to do it for you. These are the kind of, we're just going to kind of go through give you a level of awareness so you know the questions to ask them. We go to the next slide, Michelle. So just on taxonomy, and many of you have seen this before because you've seen the you've made comments to FERC. They have a online system where you can go and look at the taxonomy, you can look at the version, and this is from that. And so this is the taxonomy in a GUI format or a visual format, so you can see what it looks like. So if you go to the next slide, Michelle. And so what the taxonomy does, it really just defines all the data that needs to be reported, and it tries to do that, and it does that in a standardized way. So if you look at the FERC taxonomy or the SEC taxonomy or taxonomy for regulatory reporting for banks, whatever it is, it's the data that's being requested is always formatted in exactly the same way. So this has a lot of strengths. That means one software application can be written, and that same software application can be written for SEC, FERC filing, or filing in Europe or Asia or wherever. So it just really tries to standardize and get economies of scale. We're not custom designing software for every single possible data collection method that's out there. So this means the same software could be used for filing all FERC forms as well. And so the taxonomy here, this is just an example. It includes information, includes labels, which is at the top, which basically what's the name of this concept when it appears in different schedules. The taxonomy also include references, which basically reference the element back to the original GPS location on the form. So you can see here, so the service company property was reported on the balance sheet in column 2, row 2. Column D, sorry, row 2. And that was the current value, whereas column E had the prior period value. So that's kind of all incorporated in the taxonomy, so that you can use that data to map from the form to the taxonomy. And those references are actually what we use to take the data from the Visual FoxPro database and then basically create the example instances that are available on the FERC website, which we'll have a look at in a minute. And then finally, there's some properties about it. So service property company, this is obviously balance sheet items. So it has a period type of instant, it has a debit balance. And so it just has some, and it's, we expect a monetary item type to be reported for that. So there's additional information in the taxonomy, which, basically captures that. And so the taxonomy has validation rules. So a lot of this data that's recorded in the taxonomy can be used in validation rules. You can write rules that say, check that all monetary items use US dollars, for example. So it gives you a lot more information about the form and what the elements mean and what's expected to be reported in them. So we go to the next slide, please, Michelle. And so just talking about the references, this is a mapping, and we're going to make mapping available for the Form 60. It's not up on our website yet, but this is an example one for the Form 1, for example. But for every schedule, we'll print out this basically this lookup table. So you could look up the row and the column number, and then you can see what the element was. And it basically says, oh, if I've got a value in row 4, column D, then I should use the element utility plant and construction work in progress, and I should use the current reporting period to report that. So it basically gives you a map. So if you know what data you had in a given cell, this then tells you what's the equivalent XBRL element and the equivalent period and dimension you should use. The dimension's not on here, but this mapping table includes the dimensions you should use too, which we'll talk about in a minute. Go to the next slide, Michelle. So we kind of covered this a little bit, but the taxonomy basically defines what all the data is, what type it is. Is it a monetary item type? Is it a text block? Is it a measure of area or volume or whatever it may be? And it also contains additional information, structural information about, the order which things will appear in the taxonomy, the calculations, how things will be calculated. It also defines what values can be reported and can appear on given schedules. So for example, you can't report values from values that are in one schedule on another schedule. So it kind of covers all of that. It also includes the references and the labels, which we discussed. So we go to the next slide, please. So the taxonomy, on one side you get the taxonomy, and the other side you've got the XBRL instance document. So the taxonomy, that's prepared by the FERC, that's maintained by the FERC, and they will basically publish new versions of the taxonomy if they require additional information to be reported. Now, the SEC publishes through the FASB. The FASB publish a taxonomy every year, and the reason they do that is because the accounting rules are constantly changing. If there's no changes to the form, then there won't be a new taxonomy published. So basically, the rules are written from the perspective of a form. The only reason the taxonomy is going to change is if there's been changes in the rules or the data that the FERC wants to collect. And if that happens, then a new taxonomy will be released. And then the expectation is that the filers would then switch to that new taxonomy. The report itself, this is actually what the XBRL report, or what's called an instance document, is actually what's prepared and filed by the filer. So it's a single document, and it's really analogous to a traditional form that you would file, but it's really just a list of all the data. The formatting of it, the FERC also is publishing just like a kind of a rendering. Some rendering software which will basically take that data and take the taxonomy, and then it just basically renders something that looks like the form you're used to seeing, and that's kind of useful for review. So we'll go to the next slide, please. So I think we've got some CPE questions, and I think I'll hand it over to Michelle, who's going to go through those.
Great, thanks, Campbell. Yeah, we're going to cover 2 CPE questions right now. Okay, the first one, hopefully you should be able to see this on your screen, and just click on the button that you think is most appropriate as a response. So the first question is, which of the following may be associated with a core concept in an XBRL taxonomy? Is it data type, for example, monetary, string, text block, or percent? Is it reporting entity names? Or is it period, for example, 2018, 2019, 2020? So just click on the one that you think is most appropriate, and we'll give it about another 20 seconds or so here. And I just want to remind everybody again that if you do have questions, just click on the Q&A link, and you can submit your questions directly. Okay, we're going to close down the polling here in just a second. Okay, I'm going to go on to poll number 2. Okay, in this poll, an XBRL instance document or an XBRL report can be best characterized by which of the following statements? It represents the facts reported in a financial report, for example, a 2019 Form 60. It represents a digital dictionary of concepts that need to be reported, or it represents the hierarchical structure and relationship between items needed to be reported in a financial statement. We'll give that about another 20 seconds. Okay, I'm going to close down the polling. And just so you know, I should have given you the answer to the last question, but for this question, an instance document is best represented by the statement, it represents the facts reported in a financial report, for example, a 2019 Form 60. Okay, I'm going to end the polling, and we're now going to move on to the rest of the presentation. Campbell?
Thanks, Michelle. So if you want to go to the next slide, please. So just in terms of tagging for the filers, obviously the only thing you need to worry about as a filer is how do I create the instance document? And there are some things that you may need to make decisions about, and these really relate to, and we'll go through each of these in detail, type dimensions, how do things look on the form, what do I do with duplicate values, you know, do I have to worry about the accuracy of the numbers? You know, how do I use periods? How can I use a text block item? How can I take data that I may have reported to the SEC and use that? And then in terms of processes, which you want to be aware of and you want to make sure software supports, is things like how can it validate my filing? Can I render this document so it looks like a traditional form? And, you know, what do I do about attaching footnotes? So I think those are relevant items you just need to be aware of. And some of this may get a little bit too detailed, but it's kind of, we just want to give you the general idea of the things you want to be aware of. So the first item, if you go to the next slide, please, Michelle. So type dimensions. So basically what a type dimension is one of the things that I mentioned earlier on is you don't have to, unlike SEC reporting, you don't have to report additional information in a FERC filing, and this is what's called an extension. You don't have that here, and so this was a deliberate decision so that it kind of gives makes it a lot easier for the filer. But to do that, they use something called type dimensions, and what this allows you to do is be able to define to be able to define your own data. So, and you have a lot of cases like this in a lot of the FERC forms. And it's like you'll see a schedule, and the schedule will basically be empty, and it's got a whole bunch of empty rows. And then you go through and you fill out all the rows. And whenever you have one of those cases, this is where a type dimension is used. And so an example might be for, things like a list of directors or a listing of entities that are controlled by the company, or whatever it may be. You also have the other cases where you have some of the financial statements and you have some blank rows on them, like the cash flow, and it gives you a couple of blank rows to enter values. And that's the second place where a type dimension can be used. So all of these type dimensions basically really just give you a way to indicate what the values are on a specific row. And there's a few things you should be aware of. We call it a sequence. We call them sequence tables. It's kind of a term that's used, and that's used in the FERC documentation. But every time one of these rows is used, one of those rows has an identifier associated with it, and those identifiers are called a member. So if you've got a listing of directors, or you've got a listing of companies that are controlled, or anything, whatever it may be, each of those individual rows should have an identifier associated with them. And one of the key points here is, as you go from one reporting period to another, which is for the case of Form 60, it's obviously every year, if you've got the same director, or you've got the same company, or you're referring to the same thing, you should use the same identifier for each of those individual rows. So that's kind of important to know, and the FERC expects that you're going to do that. The other thing just to be aware of, so some of these schedules may have a total at the bottom. When you have a total, the total is expected to be basically the sum of everything comprising all the rows above it. And so basically you'll have the type dimension should be on every one of those rows, but the total won't have a type dimension on it. So basically you can think of these as hey, I'm disaggregating all these this total by these components. So you go to the next slide, we have an example of this. So in this case, it's accounts receivable from associate companies. You can see here, you've got 6 accounts. And so you basically, these companies, none of these are the members themselves. These are just basically the values that you're reporting. And if you go to the next slide, you want to kind of associate an identifier with them. So you can see here, like Wisconsin Power and Light Company, we could give it a member of Wisconsin Power Light. For example, you can see on the blue box on the left, and that's going to be on this type dimension, which is what they call an axis, which is receivable from associate companies. So the next row, which is row 6, Alliant Energy Resources, basically all the values on that should have a member associated with them as well. And the name you pick, you can pick any name you like. In this case, they picked Alliant Energy Resources as the name of the member. However, if you're doing the schedule the next year round, then you want to keep those members the same. Now, one of the things to be aware of is that you can typically, use a filing. You'll typically say, okay, I want to load the filing from the previous year, and you probably want to look at the software you're using, say, hey, I want to be able to load this software, see the data, and I probably want to change it. But what it would typically do is it would then roll all the values forward. So the values at the balance at the close of the year, they would roll to become the balance at the beginning of the year. And then the members, you would want to keep those the same. And most of the software should be able to do that. The entire taxonomy and the way the rendering works is based on the basis of if you everything goes off the report year and the report period. So if you change the report year and the report period, if you advance it 1 year, then basically when you render it, all the balance at the close will become the balance at the beginning. So everything kind of just clocks over and rolls over to the next thing. So if you're taking that approach, you want to make sure that when you're preparing these schedules that the members you're using stay consistent over time, because it'll just make it significantly easier for you. We go to the next slide, Michelle. One of the issues, obviously, with this is how do I sort this stuff? You may have these things in a row, but you want to be able to control which order they appear in. And it's because when the data is reported in XBRL, it's just really just a list of all these facts. To control the order, there's something called an order number that you can put on each individual row. And this information doesn't appear on the form, but it means that you control where things will appear. And you may have a preference of where you want them to appear. And so you can use the order number to do that. If you don't have the order number on there, then the order will probably, depending on the schedule, will be based on the first field it comes across. So it'll probably be based on the title of account. But the nice thing about this is that these are just a decimal, so you can insert, if you put an order number, you could put 400.1, and then that'll insert it between row 3 and row 4 when you render the data again. The order numbers must have a dimension on them. So they would have the same sequence dimension that all the other facts on that row have. So everything on the row will have the same member associated with it. And this was kind of introduced for the FERC reporting, this sorting, because it was felt that people wanted to be able to, or filers wanted to be able to control when they rendered their forms, just to make it easier to review. So if you go and you look at the FERC website, and if you download some of your prior year filings in an XBRL format, you'll see order numbers have been added to all of those. Those order numbers, what they are is kind of meaningless. You could use the ones that the FERC's already used, and you'll see that they kind of tie up with the line numbers that were used in the filings that you'd done historically. But you can completely change those if you want as well. It doesn't really matter. That data is not really intended to be used for anything. It's really more an artifact to help control what the form looks like. So we'll go to the next slide now. Okay, so duplicate values. In some cases, you may have a schedule which totals to a total, and then that appears like on the balance sheet. The duplicates, you don't have to enter the duplicate values. If you enter a value in XBRL, that value, if that value appears in multiple forms, when you render it, it will automatically appear in multiple places. So a value is only ever entered once, and there are validation rules that stop you from entering the same value twice in the XBRL submission. So you can't do that. Now, in some cases, if the values may be the same, the actual elements may be the same, but you might have slightly different values for them. So obviously that's not possible anymore. So if you have that case, then you should use the value that's probably on the primary, financials, and then put a footnote on it to indicate that in the subschedule it doesn't add for whatever reason. Now, in some cases, we saw that there are a number of reasons why things didn't add in historical filings, and in those cases, there are separate elements. So you may see some cases where you think, oh, these elements should be the same, but they're not, because there are some, there are known cases where there was a line missing in the form, and then there were some reasons for some adjustments why they could be different. So that case does arise. Those cases do exist. So if you see that, that'll be the reason for it, where you'd expect the value from a schedule to match the form, like the balance sheet or the income statement. There may be reasons why they're not the same element. So you just may want to check that once if you've entered a total for a subschedule, that it actually appears in the balance sheet as well. Okay, go to the next slide. Accuracy in units. One of the things that the FERC requires that all values are measured to the dollar. So typically on the forms, you really didn't have to worry about this in the past, but with an XBRL, you have to kind of give an indication of how accurate the number is. So basically for every single monetary item you're going to report, you're going to want to put an accuracy of 0 on it. That's kind of just going to be the default. It's not really something to think about, but if you're using software that they have, you don't want it to default to millions or whatever. You want it to be able to just default to 0. The other thing is every monetary amount needs a unit, and all of those are going to be in US dollars. But there are, in some cases, depending on the schedule, there may be other units that are required to be reported. So you should just be, and usually they're indicated on the form. There are validation rules as well that if you use an incorrect unit, it's going to give you a validation error saying, this is valid. We don't expect that unit for this item. But you are still going to be required to enter those units in. And if you're using a software tool, it should automatically put those on for you. Some values like string items, like you can see here, like GE and NCC and IGCC, they're string items. They don't have you don't need accuracy in units associated with those because they're not a unit of measure. All right, go to the next slide, please. The other area which is a little bit more involved is periods. There may be multiple periods that are used in a filing. Obviously, there's going to be things like the opening balance and the ending year balance. So where you're entering values for these, you're going to put the date on these values for each period. So for the Form 60, it's relatively easy. It's always going to be 12/31 and then the year. So you can basically, they just need to be put on every fact. And if you're using software, that should facilitate that for you. There's two different types of periods you're going to be putting on. You're going to be, if it's a measure at a point in time, like a balance sheet item, that you can see on the top slide for service company property. So the balance at the start of the year is going to be December 31st, 2018, let's say, and then the prior year, maybe 31st of December 2017. So that's straightforward. And then the next item, you've got like a roll forward. So you got the balance at the beginning, same thing, it's 12/31/2017. The additions, the retirements, the other changes, the movement in the balance through the period is going to have two dates on it. It's going to have the start date and the end date. And all that tells you is, this is the movement over a period of time. So just to be aware that you should just kind of be aware of the periods that go on the facts. Any software you use, you want to make sure that it's got to be able to capture that information. Be careful to make sure you use the correct period. If you put these periods in incorrectly, when you render the form, the value won't appear because the form is only going to show values which have that date on it. So if you have an instance document and you have all the wrong periods on it, when you go to render the form, none of the numbers will appear in it because the form is, you can think of it like a filter. It's going to say, hey, in this cell, I'm only going to put a value which has this period value in it because this is what the FERC requires you to report. So that's really periods. For the Form 60, it's relatively easy because you don't have quarterly values. So there's additional complications with quarters, but for the Form 60, that's fine. If you're a Form 1 filer, obviously, then it's a little bit more complicated. If we go to the next item, please, Michelle. And this is the text block items. And this is, just to make sure you're aware of this. So text block really allows you to put any text in it. So we have here like a schedule, which is schedule 21, and this is for the methods of allocation. And what this company has done in the past is they just copied a table in, and so you can still do that. So you can put any HTML data into one of these text block items. In fact, actually it has to be something called XHTML, which is basically HTML, but all the tag, got to have all the closing tags on it. So you can basically copy any data, and then you can, if it's in an XHTML format, you can just drop that straight into the text block item. So if you want to, that allows you to put lots of formatting in there so you can make it look like exactly how you want it to look. And that's the same as the text block item that's used in SEC filings. So if you, I don't think any of the service companies would really, you probably don't have anything from an SEC filing, but you could, if you wanted to, if you take the footnotes from an SEC filing, you can take those and you can just drop them into this text block item. Go to the next slide, please. And here's some example just on the notes of the financials on the Form 60. So you can put the styling in those, and so you can make it look how you want to. But just a reminder, it's got to be XHTML format. If it's not, then when you go to render it, you're going to have some issues because it's going to say it's not valid. And most of the software should check that it's actually valid XHTML. Go to the next slide, please. All right, so validations. FERC's published a bunch of validation rules which go with the filing with each form, and validations apply to, so basically the entire form is one set of validations. And they're generally, the validations are pretty straightforward. They fall into fine categories. They're going to, take the totals of repeating schedules or sequence schedules and make sure they add up. They will typically add across items which are, if you've got an opening plus additions and disposals to a closing balance, it'll add those across and check those calculations. It also does some additional calculations that check the periods are correct. So it makes sure that if you've used an invalid period, it'll check that. It'll check the units are correct. We'll check that all the required elements that you have to report are there. So for example, if you don't put the report period in or the report year, you're going to have a problem with that as well. And the validations are described in instructions. We're making some instructions available which will describe what all those validations are. And the FERC has published them. They're kind of in a technical format. So we're providing some documentation just so you know what those validations are. And there is some open source software from REL which you can use to run those validations, and that should be, and most of the software vendors are incorporating those validations into their tool. But if you're looking at a software tool, you want to make sure that they are actually running the validation rules. Okay, so we can go to the next slide, please. So in terms of rendering, this is kind of an important part of this. You want to be able to take this data that you've prepared, you want to render it as a traditional form before you submit it, just so you know that you got the data correct. So this is kind of really gives you an easy way to reconcile it. You don't really want to look at an XML file and make sure it's correct. We have, and this is available as open source software as well, that the FERC has published as part of the REL open source software. This is the same software that's used by the SEC. So if you're an SEC filer, you may be familiar with it. And we've put something to make it easier for everyone. We've put some tools and instructions up on our website, which allow you to run the validations for your filing, but also to be able to allows you to run your rendering. So you can take your XML file and you can render it and see what it looks like. So maybe I can share my screen and show an example of that, Michelle. So I've taken an example here. This is American Electric Power Service Corporation. So I've got the Form 60.
Yeah, well, we're not seeing anything on your screen.
Oh, I'm sorry. So if you go to the XBRL US website, we have, it's on my screen here, we've put some of the stuff up. So this is, you can just go there and you can look at it. So if you go to XBRL US, you can go to filers, this is a thing for FERC reporting, you can click on that. And there's some various stuff which Michelle will go through later, but there's some tools and instructions, and this just gives you some things you can use. And one of these is the ability to render a file. So you can choose your file, and it just has to be a zip file. So you take your instance and just zip it, and then you can basically then select the form that this applies to. So this is a Form 60, the Service Corporation, and let's say I want to do the balance sheet, and then you can submit it. And then the thing that makes this a little bit different than we made this available as well is that you can render any particular schedule, or you can render the entire form. It's actually kind of nice to be able to render just an individual schedule, because you may prepare that schedule, then you want to have a look at it and you want to see what it looks like, and then obviously you can open it, and this is what the rendered schedule looks like. And it's just taking the XBRL filing, and it's basically, and it's just rendered this out, and you can see it's included the footnotes in here. You can see that this allows you, when you add a footnote in, you can also link these back to specific notes. these footnotes must be in an XHTML format as well, just to make sure we're aware of that. Anyway, so let's continue on. I'm just going to stop sharing, Michelle, if you want to go back to the presentation. Your slides are flipped, so if you want to switch your monitor. So just while Michelle's doing that, just in terms of footnotes, the XBRL filing also supports the ability to put footnotes on your presentation. So and I kind of showed you that before, any fact can have a footnote associated with it. And this means, obviously footnotes were used quite extensively prior to XBRL, so that all that kind of functionality is still there. You can have one or many footnotes associated with a individual fact. You can have multiple facts pointing to one footnote as well if you wanted to do that. So both of those things are options. The other thing that has been included with footnotes is the ability to, within the regulations, you do have the option to be able to request that information remains confidential. So if you wanted to do that, I don't think anyone's ever done it before, but that can be done with a footnote as well. So there's a footnote that just points to the fact, which says, I want this fact to be confidential. So if you submit that when you submit that to the FERC, that will flag on a FERC system, and then they'll basically come back to you and tell you if you're allowed to have that as if that's information can be confidential or not. And if it is, then when the filing is published on their website, that information will be blacked out. So that's obviously that information will be available to the FERC, but not to the public. So that kind of option has been in there as well. That was available in the VisualFox program, but it was kind of buried. But that's also supported in the XBRL filings. The footnotes themselves can have styling in them, so they can be formatted in XHTML as well. So you can put schedules and graphics and anything you want really in those. So those footnotes can basically support anything you'd put on a traditional web page. So we go to the next slide. I think, Michelle, you're going to take over and talk about software vendors.
Yeah, I'm going to talk a little bit about vendors and how you can get started. And this really builds off what Campbell was talking about early on about the different options that are available to you as filers. And there are a number of companies that provide different types of services, from complete outsourcing services where you essentially give over your completed form to a vendor and then they prepare it for you and give it back to you in XBRL format, to solutions where you may have an application, maybe a web-based, a cloud-based solution, or a desktop solution that you can use yourself to generate the XBRL data. And these are a number of vendors that work with XBRL US that are XBRL US members. And these are organizations that we know have developed filings for SEC reporting, for different types of reporting. And so they're pretty knowledgeable in the whole XBRL space. And these are companies including Advanced Computer Innovations, DataTrax, Donnelly Financial Solutions, Iris Business Services, NovaWorks, P3 Data Systems, RGG Filings, Systrends, and Workiva. And some of these may be companies that you're already using in your SEC reporting area, so it may be worth checking in with those folks to see what they're using, or just come to our website and check out some of the vendors, because we have lots of information about what they do up on our website. And when you do start reaching out to different types of vendors, there are certain things that you should look for. And some of the questions that you may want to ask are, does the application that you're considering support FERC validation? As Campbell discussed during the presentation today, that's really, really important to making sure that you get good quality data produced. So you want to be sure that they have a mechanism to provide that kind of validation. You also want to make sure that they handle type dimensions. There are some XBRL providers that do not have type dimensions, and anybody that's working with SEC reporting does, because that taxonomy has type dimensions. But this is really critical in working with the FERC taxonomy. Also, check with them about what kind of experience they have preparing XBRL for other entities. How long have they been doing it? How long will it take them to prepare your filing? Will you be able to review the XBRL tags that are used on each fact? Many of the vendors that are members of XBRL US have various tools and applications that allow you to see what the rendering looks like and to see what tags have been chosen for each element, each fact that you report. And it's really important for you to be able to do that, because obviously these are your filings. You can't just kind of hand it off to a vendor and assume that they're going to, they will have your best interest at heart, of course, but it's the filing is really yours. You may have a situation where there are multiple parties internally that need to review the form. You may need to send it to compliance and to legal and to accounting and to various organizations within your company, and you want to make sure that you have a tool to handle that. Something else that is important to ask about is if you need to change a value in a report, say at the last minute, how long will the vendor need to make that change? And this is a common situation. In preparing your filing that sometimes things change at the last minute. You want to make sure that you're not in a situation where it's going to take another couple of days or a week or whatever to make that change in your XBRL formatted version. Something else to ask about is how will the process differ the second time around? This sounds a bit odd, but what we found is that there is a learning curve to get up the first time that you prepare a filing, and it gets easier the second time and the third time and the fourth time, and even easier for your vendor as they get to know the process that you're working through and they get to understand your financials a little bit better. So, get a sense from that from your vendor, because, they may have some good news to share in terms of how this is going to get more streamlined over time. And then the final question you might want to ask is, can the vendor give you a printout of the FERC rendering of your filing? Because this, again, may be something that will help you do a double check to make sure that the facts are reported the way you want them to be reported. And so with that, I'm going to go on to our next set of poll questions. And I'm going to bring these poll questions up. And again, if you do have questions for Campbell, now is a good time to ask them. And as I'm bringing up the next poll question, and hopefully you all can see this, the next poll question is, which statement best describes the FERC taxonomy? Is it number one, an open taxonomy, which means that FERC filers can create new custom reported items that are not in the current FERC taxonomy? Is it number two, a closed taxonomy, which means that FERC filers are limited to using only the concepts provided in the FERC taxonomy? Or is it number three, a hybrid taxonomy, which means that FERC allows some custom extensions to be created? So we'll give that about another 30 seconds. So just click on the link, the button rather, to whichever one seems most appropriate. Okay, just another 5 seconds or so. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and close the poll. And just for the answer to that, the FERC taxonomy is considered closed. So you are not allowed to create new custom extensions. You can use type dimensions, which is a way of having a little bit more flexibility, but that is still considered a closed taxonomy. Okay, and then I'm going to go to our last poll question. Which statement best represents the definition of the XBRL standard? Is it number one, a technical format like XML, JSON, or CSV? Or is it number two, an open, non-proprietary standard that renders financial and other types of data into machine-readable format? Or is it number three, it is a product like Excel or a software application that makes data computer-readable? Which of those statements best represents what the XBRL standard is? Okay, we're going to take about another 20 seconds. Okay, I'm going to be closing down the poll now. And just so you know, the correct answer to that it is an open, non-proprietary standard that renders financial and other types of data into machine-readable format. So thanks very much for all of you getting CPE credit and for responding to those polls. Just a last couple of slides I wanted to take you through. Campbell mentioned some various applications and tools that we're making available to FERC filers. Obviously, we're a nonprofit standards organization. Our mission really is to successfully implement data standards in the US. And so we want all of you to be successful. So we have put together a set of tools and you can go to our website, go to this webpage, xbrl.us/FERC-reporting. And we'll be sending links out to all of you in the next day or two so that you can get access to this page. But if you go to FERC reporting and you'll see tools and instruction, which includes things like the renderer that Campbell showed you, the mapping guides that Campbell talked about. Also, you can link directly to the FERC taxonomy and we'll also be adding FERC validation rules to this page as well very soon. The second picture that you see there is for running applications locally. There may be some situations where you prefer to run things internally rather than upload something to our server. And you can do that using the code and instructions that we post on that section. We also have data. We're going to be posting data here for filers. And then finally, education. We'll be continuously adding here educational resources to support you as you begin adopting the XBRL data standards next year. So please visit this page. And again, we'll send this link out to everybody to make sure that you have access to it. And finally, I just want to talk about some additional events coming up that may be of interest. We have some additional instructional webinars for FERC filers. December 10th, we'll be doing one for electric transmitting utilities. And as I mentioned, coming up in the first quarter, we're going to have a lot of additional webinars that'll be more, also educational in nature to really help you get ready for the filing compliance periods. We also have some other webinars that are not specific to FERC, but may be of interest to you. Actually, this Thursday, December 3rd, we have DQC rule sets 13 and 14 and FASB DQC rules taxonomy. This relates to SEC filers who are preparing their documents for EDGAR submission. So please join us or forward this link on to colleagues within your organization. And then on December 15th, we have a session on automating sustainability data with XBRL. And this webinar is going to focus on some data standards that were built by the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, the SASB, for use by corporate issuers preparing sustainability documents. So we hope to see you at that event as well. So that's all we have today. And I want to thank everybody for joining us. And we hope to see you at more sessions coming up over the next weeks and into the first of the year. Thank you very much. And thanks very much, Campbell, for your presentation on the Form 60.